Let's get this sports podcast party started, all right?
The JAYREELZ podcast.
What is happening, my good people? Greetings. How are you? How's it going? How's everybody doing out there? What is the latest and greatest? Hope everybody's doing well, feeling fantastic, in excellent spirits. Kickstarting another jam-packed week of sports talk as I detail all of the latest and greatest. Thanks for tuning in to get your fix, as this is the JAYREELZ podcast with your host, JAYREELZ. For my first timers, welcome aboard. And for those who've been banging with me going back to the very beginning, somewhere in the middle or even as early as this past Thursday, I welcome you guys and gals back. And now as we approach the middle of October, and now that the championship series in both the American League and National League are here, before I even get into what happened last night, game one, where the Mets were just bullied, were just manhandled by the Dodgers, and when you look at what Jack Flaherty did, he looked like Oral Hershiser circa 1988. I'll get to that in a minute. I want to rewind. I'll start with the National League only because when the Mets clinched the division series last Wednesday, of course, we talked about it on Thursday's podcast, but since then, you had one other game in the National League that we have to discuss, which leads into last night, and then obviously a big game two today. So that's where I'm going to begin. The Dodgers, who were facing elimination, they were down 2-1, and as we talked about on Thursday, where Mookie Betts hitting that home run in the first inning, you almost kind of felt that maybe some pressure was relieved. And as you saw throughout the course of that game, they won 8-0 heading into Friday night's do-or-die Game 5. And funny as this may sound, that even though the Dodgers always are going to face pressure because of their high payroll, because of the expectations, and their manager, who a lot of people have a microscope under when it comes to his decision-making, when it comes to his lack of success here, especially in this round, where in the division series the last 2 years, losing to the Padres in 2022, inexplicably getting swept by the Arizona Diamondbacks just last year, and they had to somehow, some way, find a way to get themselves past this point to get to a championship series. And by winning on Friday night 2-0, where all they got was 2 solo home runs from the Hernandezes, whether your name is Kike or Teoscar. And even though Yu Darvish, the starter of the Padres, who pitched very well, retired 13 straight at one point, but those 2 mistakes doomed him and doomed the Padres, who did a lot of chirping, a lot of flexing, and a lot of arrogance on their side. And all they have to show for it is 0 runs over the last 2.5 games. After scoring 6 runs there in that game number 3, they were not to be found throughout the rest of the series, including 2 hits there on Friday night. And the Padres, what more can you say? They had a big regular season, especially a even bigger second half. And a lot of people have picked them to go to a World Series based on their performance in the second half of the season. But after them not showing up there in those final 2 games to the point where they weren't able to scratch off 1 run, and the Dodgers, who have continued their pitching brilliance, is now, I'll segue that into last night's game. And you have to think that by them not only just beating the Padres, but by them getting over the hump past the division series for the first time since 2021, if you could believe, you kind of felt like all the air has been lifted. The piano has been off their back. Now they could put that to rest and just focus in on a championship series where I don't know if they're heavily favored, because I'm not one to look at the odds makers and see, which team is the big favorite or a solid favorite. I would think the Dodgers were a solid favorite considering what the Mets have done this offseason, or this postseason, excuse me. But how I looked at it was, going into the game last night, I thought, I could see this being a situation where the Dodgers, not to say they're going to be in cruise control, not to say that they're not going to break a sweat, although last night they barely did. And I'll talk about the game in a minute, but how I looked at it was, maybe this could be a situation where the Mets, not to say they're going to head into a buzzsaw, but you would think with the Dodgers now having to exhale a little bit, releasing a lot of that pressure from that division series, and not only that, but division series past, now they could kind of just take a look at the land and say, all right, championship series, here we go. Now let's get to the point where the Dodgers, as a lot of people, including yours truly, thought from the beginning of the season it was going to be World Series or bust. Now, I didn't even pick them to go to a World Series. I picked the Phillies. That's how much I know. But for last night, let's get right to it, where Kodai Senga walked the ballpark. And now when you talk about strategy, and I'll get more into the Mets in a second. Let me just get into the game first. With Senga walking the ballpark, 30 pitches in an inning in the third, 20 of them balls. And as he walked the ballpark, and it looked like maybe he was going to get out of it, but that wasn't going to be the case, as Max Muncy got the single there to make it 2-0. Ohtani tacked on another run there in the third, 3-0. And the only threat that the Mets had throughout the course of the evening, top of the fourth, where Lindor walked, and after 2 outs, Alonso walked, and then Starling Marte hit a ball, which looked like it had a chance to go out, but Mookie Betts caught it at the warning track. To me, that's why I thought, not to say the game was over, but I thought that was going to be the Mets' best chance, at least at that moment, because the next thing you know, the Dodgers turned the bottom of the fourth into another crooked number where they scored 3 runs to make it 6-0. And at that point, in the immortal words of Warner Wolf, the former newscaster here in New York City, CBS, you could just turn your sets off there. And then Jack Flaherty, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, he was dominant, 7 innings, 2 hits, 2 walks, 6 strikeouts. Again, was I watching Oral Hershiser Game 7 in the 1988 NLCS Game 7? Well, it was a mirror image, although he didn't complete the game. But for Flaherty, who has been in and out, up and down throughout the course of the last couple of years with injuries, ineffectiveness, and even ineffectiveness in the previous series against the Padres, well, the Mets certainly made him look like Cy Young as they cruised to a 9-0 victory. They tacked on 3 more runs. Mookie Betts hit a bases-clearing double, and that's all she wrote. Nothing else to really get into, unpack about the game last night. And if you're a Met fan, I'm sure you're probably wondering today whether or not Sean Manaea and his magical left arm of this last few months, is he going to be able to bring the series back to Citi Field tied at 1? I'll talk about that game in a second, but for the Mets, as a fan, let's not get crazy. It's 1 loss. It's a bad loss. Very bad, but better that than to lose a heartbreaker in the 9th inning, up 4-2, and then Diaz comes in and melts down and they lose 5-4. So what you do with that is just flush it. Don't even worry about it. A quick turnaround, as the game is at 4:08 p.m. this afternoon. So it's not as if they have to sit around the hotel all day and mull it over and think about what had happened last night. Nope, it's back to the ballpark. Let's get it cracking, and hopefully the Mets could do something to that Dodger rotation and bullpen, because they have now pitched 33 shutout innings dating back to the Padres series and now the first 9 innings of this series. You know that this is going to get snapped at some point. There's no way that the Dodgers, who have now thrown 3 straight shutouts, and only the 1905 Tigers were able to do that. So for the Met offense, they're going to have to wake up at some point, and maybe today could be the day, considering it's going to be a bullpen game. And what I said yesterday, if you watched on YouTube in my little NLCS brief view, how I looked at it was, are the Mets going to have similar success to what they did against the Phillies in this round against the Dodgers? And for me, in order for the Mets to win the series, that's what's going to have to happen. Because what we've seen there in the previous series, what the Dodger bullpen has done, and for them to carry that on into this series, if they're going to have the same type of success, then the Mets are going to be doomed. And you can say that for any bullpen, I get that. But the Dodgers, who their starting rotation is pretty thin, I get it. Yamamoto gave you a very good performance there on Friday night. And then look at what Flaherty did yesterday. You also have down the road here, when we look at this series overall, Walker Buehler, is he going to be a guy that's going to recapture some of that magic that he had from years past? Or is he going to be a guy that's going to struggle and not going to really find his rhythm? And then you're going to see Jack Flaherty if there is a Game 5, and I don't expect the same Flaherty you saw in Game 1 and Game 5. Now, obviously, the Mets have to win a game between now and then in order for Flaherty to show up there for what we would deem to be a pivotal Game 5, whether that means it's 2-2 and who's going to take the lead in that series, or if the Mets are down 3-1 and staring at the offseason, or dare I even say that the Mets are up 3-1. But with that being said, the Mets are going to have to really do a number on this Dodger bullpen, and maybe somehow, some way, with the few days that they had off, they'll show a little bit of rust and maybe some cobwebs there so that the Mets could capitalize and get this series back to Citi Field tied at 1. And how I look at this series prior to yesterday's game, I said Dodgers in 6. And I know I got some people at me saying that, oh, come on, you got to believe JAYREELZ Mets in 6, so on and so forth. Like I mentioned earlier, I think the Dodgers getting past the Padres and past the divisional series, now it's almost as if they're able to open the windows of their quote-unquote home and now let the fresh air in to the point where all that stale air, 2 years ago, losing to San Diego, last year getting swept by the Diamondbacks, and then now down 2-1 where it was pressure-packed baseball. But you couldn't tell because the rotation and their bullpen showed up bigger than you could ever expect if you're a Dodger fan. But we know that's not going to last. This shutout streak is going to end. Hopefully the Mets could put up a bunch of crooked numbers in their own right to get themselves back in the series and not have to fly back down 0-2. Because even though it would be no harm, no foul, the Dodgers would serve home field. And if the Mets could do the same to go back to LA, maybe up 3-2. But in all likelihood, that may not be the case. I think today is a huge game for Sean Manaea. Let's see if he can carry that performance against the Phillies in the previous series into today's game. And if the Mets could just steal a game, I don't care how they do it, scratch a run against that bullpen. And it's not as if that bullpen, granted they've been lights out and you have to give them credit, but the same was said about the Philly bullpen coming into that series. And what happened? They were literally a house of cards that just collapsed against the Mets as we saw there last week. So maybe the Dodgers, even though they could read the press clippings and think that, oh, we have this indomitable bullpen, who knows? Maybe they'll fold like a cheap suit and the Mets can get back in the series. And that's all I can say. So if the Mets don't hit that bullpen, on top of the pressure being lifted off the Dodger organization, forget about even just the team, that's why I think the Dodgers, and who knows, this could be the first of 2 trips to New York, considering that the Yankees and the Guardians will play game 1 tonight. And of course, I'll get to them in a minute. So that's the best way that I can assess this Mets-Dodger series. And yes, we could talk about now the strategy here with Senga as far as pitching him as an opener when you really think about it. But with Dave Pederson going in, and Pederson was not good yesterday as you saw, but do you bring him back in a game 5, especially if it's going to be for your season, or even more so maybe to take a 3-2 series lead as opposed to putting Senga in there? And Senga, you got 1 inning in Philadelphia, really 2 innings. So was it 2 innings in Philadelphia? Yes. You pitched 2 innings in Philadelphia and didn't even get through 2 yesterday. Is Senga going to be even worth starting at this point? I understand coming out of the bullpen, a lot of that wildness that you saw there yesterday was indicative of the first half of the season last year, because he's a guy that he's more pitching out of the zone. And what we saw there with the Dodgers, they were taking a lot of those pitches, the ghost forkball and pitches that a lot of teams are going to start chasing. Dodgers didn't do that, and that's where Senga got in trouble. So if I were Carlos Mendoza, the manager, and I get it, Pederson, he was due to have a bad outing, so I'm not going to fault him on that. But I would go back to Pederson there in game 5 as the starter, and maybe Senga could be a guy that could give you, not necessarily length, but could give you an inning, maybe 2, if Pederson falters. That's how I'm going to look at it. And I get it that Senga, he has the mentality of a starter. And even though he's a guy that wants to pitch every 6th day as opposed to 5th day, and with game 5 being Friday, and obviously he'll have normal rest, I think him coming out of the bullpen will be a lot better than him starting a game 5, whether that means for your season or for a chance to take a 3-2 series lead. So, or maybe even clinching the whole thing, but chances are I don't think that's going to happen. So that would be me if I was Mendoza, and I'm sure they're going to mull that over. They don't have to worry about that now. They're going to have Sean Manaea followed by Severino and Quintana. I believe that's going to be the order. You figure righty, lefty, heading into a game 5 if it does go that far. So that's what you have there with the NLDS. As far as the American League goes, have to rewind a little bit. I'll start with the Yankees. Big game for Garrett Cole there on Thursday, and I understand it's the Royal offense, but it is the postseason, and they did win a game earlier in the series, and obviously, I'm not going to say they did a number on Garrett Cole in game 1, but they were able to put across runs and even a little bit of power by Kansas City in that first game, but obviously did not come out with the win. But Cole, 7 masterful innings, gave up a run there during that little melee, if you want to call it that, at second base where Michael Garcia, and I don't think he went high. Volpe, as he lunged to make the tag on that double play, also came in high on it with his right arm across the neck of Garcia. And I think that perturbed him more than anything because you saw Volpe get up and he just pat him on the back 1,000 times and say, oh, my bad, it's okay, it's all right, it's fine, no worries. You know he didn't want any smoke there. But then Jazz Chisholm came across the diamond from third base to jaw at Michael Garcia, and Garcia just stood silent, didn't say anything because he knew that if anything was going to erupt there, he was going to get tossed and didn't want to put his team in jeopardy. But the Yankees were able to prevail, and they win the series 3-1, winning 3-1 there on Thursday night. And that's no shock. They're supposed to take care of the Royals, and obviously they did so in pretty easy fashion. A bunch of low-scoring games. Other than game one, the other games were 4-2, I believe, 3-1, and then 3-1 again, or was it 2-1? I don't even know, but the Yankees won, and that's all you got to say about that. Now, the other series, Detroit and Cleveland, the Tigers looked like they were going to go for the hammer. They looked like that they were going to be able to see if they could, punch their ticket to an American League Championship Series there on Thursday. That was not to be, thanks to David Fry with the big home run in the 7th inning, which propelled them to a big win against the Tigers. And then on Saturday, where you had Tarek Skubal, who right now is probably the best pitcher in Major League Baseball, after the Tigers getting a run there, I believe in the top of the 4th, you thought if Skubal could just go 6-7 and then maybe the bullpen could salvage and get out of Cleveland with a series win. That was not to be the case. Bases got loaded. He hits Jose Ramirez on the forearm with the bases juiced, and that brought in the first run. And then Lane Thomas, first pitch fastball right down Broadway, over the wall there in left center field, and that was it for Skubal, as he was unable to get out of that inning with just a 1 run, or maybe even less than that, maybe just a couple of runs, or I should say a little bit more, less than the 5 that he gave up, of course. But for Cleveland, that was a gut check for them. They had a big regular season. As you saw, down 2-1. Tigers had them. Looked like it was on the ropes there, not only in Game 4, but also Game 5. And Skubal was unable to deliver there. And Cleveland goes on to a 7-3 win, to where now they face off against the Yankees, who they know very well, not only from an organizational standpoint, but even over the last half-decade. They played in a wild card in 2020 where the Guardians got swept there. They played just 2 years ago where the Yankees lost in 5 after they were down 2-1 in that series. And now they face off again. And we know historically they faced each other plenty of times over the years, but only once in an ALCS, which of course was the famed 98 year, where the Guardians were also up, or at the time the Indians, they were up 2-1 in that series. And you got to thank El Duque for saving their bacon, winning a game number 4 in Cleveland. And then, of course, they won the subsequent 2 games before going on to a World Series and sweeping the Padres. So now that you have this series on the horizon, which will start 7:38 tonight, here are the 2 things that I'm going to look at here if the Guardians have any shot to win. And let's face it, the Yankees, if they're not heavily favored, I'm sure they're a solid favorite, similar to the Dodgers against the Mets. First and foremost, the bullpen of the Guardians, and in particular Clase. Is he going to be able to lock down? And he was not great. He gave up the 3-run homer to Kerry Carpenter, as you saw, and he did give up a home run there late in, not game 5, in game number 4. And Clase, he's shown some warts here. Now, if the Guardians, let's say tonight, they have a 3-1 lead going into the 9th inning, and he's facing Soto, Judge, Wells, who shouldn't be a cleanup hitter, but Stanton also lying in the wings, is he going to be able to hang on there and close out a Yankee offense that, as we all know, has kind of stumbled here a little bit? Stanton has been well, and Soto, but the rest of the lineup, not great, including a one Aaron Judge, although he seemed to break out of it a little bit in Game 4. But to me, that's going to be the telltale sign, because the Guardians aren't going to line up the scoreboard, minus what you saw there in game number 5 against the Tigers. Obviously, a grand slam is certainly going to help when it comes to the final score. But the Guardians, they're a team that's going to scratch, claw, fight, and do whatever it takes to get runs. This is not a power-hitting lineup. This is not your daddy's Indian team of Albert Bell, Manny Ramirez, Jim Tomei, going down the list, Sandy Alomar, etc. So for this Guardian team, how they're going to muster up runs, it's going to be interesting to see. And against a Yankee team and a rotation that's going to have Carlos Rodon starting tonight, and Rodon, he could either be feast or famine. He could give you 6 solid innings and pile up the strikeouts and maybe have a 2-run, 5-hit performance, or he'll be a guy that will be 4 1/3, or maybe even 3 1/3, 4 runs, 5 hits, 3 walks, and 2 strikeouts. Which one is going to show up tonight? And then you're going to have Garrett Cole pitch game 2. But to me, how are they going to close out? And also, how are they going to be able to match with the Yankees, especially when it comes to scoring runs? Because we know the Yankees have a ton of power, and the Guardians don't. And it's led by that leadoff hitter, Stephen Kwan, who I think is fantastic. He's a guy that is going to be key in the series. He's going to have to set the table and get big hits, as you saw there in the division series. If he's a guy that's going to be silenced, and I get it, the one power bat in that lineup is Jose Ramirez, which I'm sure they're going to pick and choose the Yankees their spots on how to approach him and situations. But how I look at it is that who else in that Guardian lineup is going to be able to step up and really try to match with what the Yankees are going to do? And I'm not trying to say from a power standpoint, but they're going to have to string along hits and pass the baton. They're not going to be sitting around waiting for a 3-run homer in order for them to win these games. So, and then of course the Guardians, their rotation isn't anything to sneeze at either. They're, of course, a bullpen that's going to be dominant, and maybe when it's all said and done, which bullpen is going to rise to the occasion? Is it going to be Clase and company, or is it going to be Weaver and company that is going to prevail and maybe win a series? How I look at it overall, I like the Yankees in 5. I'm not even going to say 6. I'm not giving the Guardians 2 games. Could they win 2 games? I think they could. And you know what? Maybe in my gut, I'm shortchanging them. But the Yankees, listen, this isn't a dominant Yankee team. This isn't a Yankee team that, despite the fact of them being favorites, that are just going to run roughshod over the Guardians. I think they can, and there's a part of me I think they will, but the Yankees have their lulls. We've seen it. Look at what happened there against the Royals in Game 2. Granted, it was just one game that they lost, but Judge, he may be squeezing the bat too tight. Let's see if that Game 4 carries over into this series. Stanton and Soto have been very good here so far in this first round. And what are they going to get from Gleyber Torres? What are they going to get from Jazz Chisholm, Austin Wells? Guys like that obviously are going to be key contributors in order for the Yankees to win, because this can't be all on the shoulders of Soto, Judge, and Stanton. And I'll say Soto and Judge because those have been the 2 guys that have been dominant throughout the whole regular season, where Stanton obviously has been on the shelf, and although he has contributed, but hasn't been a consistent force in that lineup throughout the 162-game season. So I like the Yankees in 5, and again, this is a cakewalk for the Yankees here. Royals first round, and now the Guardians. And I know that I'm knocking both of these franchises. They've had big regular seasons, but it is the AL Central. You're not facing an Oriole team who has a very stout lineup, and certainly not the old nemesis in the Houston Astros. So if the Yankees don't win this series, again, there will still need to be an investigation as to why they are not winning another AL pennant to their franchise's history. And as far as the matchups overall, when it comes to the World Series, and I had these discussions over the weekend with some friends, and even my wife for that matter, and she's saying, oh, you're just a hater, you just don't want the Yankees and the Mets to play, and you don't want to be sick to your stomach if the Mets lose to the Yankees. As I detailed last week, so you have to go back to the podcast, I don't want any part of the Yankees in a World Series if it happens to be Mets-Yankees. But if you're Rob Manfred in the suits at Fox, I know you'll take Mets-Yankees, but you know, to a man and a woman in the MLB offices, they are hoping and praying for a Yankee-Dodger World Series. And to me, and I said this throughout, Yankees-Dodgers is a whole hell of a lot bigger than Yankees-Mets. We saw it in 2000. It didn't capture America. It barely captured outside of the tri-state area. Because for those who are in Little Rock, Arkansas, or El Paso, Texas, or Provo, Utah, or even San Francisco, California, nobody cares about the Subway Series. Yankees-Dodgers, a baseball fan, maybe even a casual, or even a good sports fan, will pay attention. East Coast, West Coast, Yankees-Dodgers, Judge Ohtani, and this should be a ratings bonanza. Second, I won't even say Yankees-Mets. I'll say second could actually be, believe it or not, you ready for this, people? Dodgers and Guardians. And I say that because you're going to have the little engine that could, small market, go up against the big market and the Dodgers. Now, I understand if the Guardians make it, I'm sure they want no part of it. Meaning MLB, that is. Because you're going to have a situation like last year with the Guardians, although they weren't a wild card team, but they're going to be the Arizona Diamondbacks of this year if they make it to a World Series. But I say Dodgers Guardians because you're going to have David and Goliath. You're going to have an underdog team to root for. And then, of course, you have the big bad LA Dodgers with Shohei Ohtani, Mookie Betts, and Freddie Freeman. So I'd almost look at that as being a second tier or second series that maybe Major League Baseball and overall we'll see. Yankees Mets would be third. I know it's New York versus New York, and I know the Mets, this team is a lot better than that 2000 team, despite the fact they had a star in Mike Piazza, but because of the magic carpet ride that they've been on and what they've been able to accomplish here so far in this postseason, that a lot of people may look at that and say, oh wait, I'm going to root for the Mets because I don't want to root for the Yankees. But again, that's just here in the tri-state area. Nobody outside of that's going to care. You think the Philly fans going to care about a Met-Yankee World Series? You think the Dodger fans going to care about a Met-Yankee World Series? Nobody. And I get it. They're New Yorkers throughout the country and the globe. But it is not going to be a big-time attraction unless you get to a seventh game to where maybe people will tune in. And I get it. That was a 5-game series where the Yankees, although they were all close games, but you knew in your heart of hearts that the Yankees were not going to lose that series. And then lastly, Mets Guardians, and although you will have a storyline with Francisco Lindor going up against his former team, but nobody's going to care. Mets Guardians? Really? That's not even a David and Goliath. That's why I said Dodgers Guardians second, only because of that dynamic. But Mets Guardians, nobody's going to tune into that. That's going to be Arizona, Texas last year all over again. It really is. Because the Dallas market, although it's huge, but at least the Mets are New York, so that's where the similarities lie. And just like I mentioned, the Guardians are going to be Arizona. So if it's Guardians-Mets, they are going to choke on their kale salads. If it's Yankees-Mets, they'll be happy about it because it's a Subway Series, but the rest of the country, they're going to jump ship. Dodgers-Guardians, not a sexy matchup in the least. But again, David versus Goliath, and then Yankees-Dodgers. If they can't generate big ratings for this series, then baseball's going to be done from now until the end of time. And we're not going to get ratings in the 20s unless it gets to a Game 7. But all I have to say before I move on to the other sports, if it is Yankees-Dodgers, and with all this star power, the attraction, the brands, the history between the two organizations, granted, I get it. You got to go back to the 40s and 50s with the Brooklyn Dodgers, especially in this area. And then you have to go back to the 80s when they last met in 81. And even though, of course, 77, 78. But 40 some odd years later to have this rivalry renewed and for this to not be a big thing, even in the midst of an NFL season and with basketball starting and the hockey season and college football in full blaze, if they can't generate ratings here, baseball's toast. And that's all I'll say about that. No other baseball news to report as far as off the field, managers, things of that nature, so I'll just leave it there. Let me turn my attention and put on the helmet and shoulder pads to get to the NFL as well as college football. And college football, I'm going to have a very interesting take, people, so you definitely want to stay tuned for that. As, yes, it is going to be, I don't want to say it's going to be a hot take. I'm not into the hot takes, but one that you're certainly going to raise your eyebrows when I get to in a few minutes. The NFL, as we conclude Week 6 tonight with Buffalo and the Jets. We all know what happened there last week with one Robert Saleh. Now you have Jeff Ulrich. Let's see how he does, as that's a huge game for the Jet franchise, for the franchise. Because if they lose this game tonight to Buffalo, they'll be already 2.5 games behind in the standings, and now they're going to have to suffer for a wild card spot if they even get to that point. But that's going to be a big game. I would think the Jets are going to come out flying considering all the news and everything that happened this past week. I can see the Jets eking out a win. It'll be tough because Buffalo's already lost 2 in a row. Can they actually lose 3 in a row here during this stretch where they lost to Baltimore on a Sunday night, last week in Houston, and now the Jets again? Highly unlikely, but with the circumstances of what took place in Florham Park, and somehow, some way, I think they're going to be revved up, ready to go to put their season back on the tracks after just 2 brutal losses. I see the Jets as eking out a very close win, tying them with the Bills at the top of the AFC East, but having the advantage there with the tiebreaker. Now, this NFL season, I'm sorry, people. I get it that you've had some pockets of some good news and good feel stories, whether the Commanders and Jaden Daniels, and we could talk about the Lions, and yesterday, we're just their win yesterday, and also that win was almost a loss, which I'll get to. But the three storylines that to me come out of yesterday, one, the Cowboys. How they performed here at home has just been mind-blowing. And I understand they're the walking wounded, and I understand they're depleted defensively, offensively, you name it. But for the Lions to go in there and put up 47 points, and we understand that they have a very good offense, but to only score 9 points despite the fact you have no running game, no receivers, your pass rush is non-existent, and you're having hook and laterals to offensive linemen, to what you've seen there yesterday, to where they just got embarrassed. And even Jerry Jones had to come out to say, oh, well, the coach, Mike McCarthy, is going to be fine right now. Listen, they just won a big game in Pittsburgh last week, and that might as well have been 10 years ago. But that was as bad as a loss that the Cowboys have had at home in quite some time, I could say, but not really, because they got blown out by the Saints there in their home opener. And then, of course, in the playoff game against the Packers, where it was, 41-16 before they made it 46-32 or 46-16, whatever it was. So now they have to regroup and see what they could do to try to get themselves back on track, as they're at 500. So that's storyline number one. Number two, Doug Pederson, does he even survive at this point? Where the Chicago Bears, who have had their moments here of late, but not have been world beaters to say the least, well, you can kind of scratch that, because, boy, they made Jacksonville look like a JV team there yesterday on the other side of the pond. And remember, they are staying in London because they're going to be the home team this week with the Patriots. That's right, the Patriots are going to play Jacksonville. And I got news right here for everybody to open up and listen to. If somehow, some way the Patriots win that game, and I'm not going out on a limb by saying this, Doug Pederson does not make it on that flight back home. That's it. He cannot lose to the Patriots, as we've seen here recently. And Drake May's now the starter, as you saw against the Texans day yesterday. He did throw 3 touchdowns, but also threw some interceptions, as he got his baptism by fire against the Texans there in Foxborough, as they lost 41-21. So it's good I can get that game out of the way. Texans looking formidable, as we've seen here, now 5-1. But for Pederson, and I've chronicled what he's done here over the last 2 years, and I'm not going to regurgitate that, but this is a team that is going nowhere fast. They signed their quarterback to a $250 million deal. And yes, just like any other team, they've had injuries. Even Calvin Ridley is upset and just angry at what's going on there. Not being able to catch a pass and not being included here in the offense, which could be an indictment on the head coach there and Doug Pederson. So does he make it at all as far as him coming back to the United States, having a job? And we're going to see, because that's going to be a big game for that organization, because Shad Khan, the owner, I know they gave him and the GM a vote of confidence coming into this week, but losing to the Bears, and yes, they have offensive pieces. The quarterback is starting to flourish here a little bit, and one Caleb Williams. They have good tight end, DJ Moore, etc. But 35-16? Really? Seriously? That's just a terrible job by Jacksonville. And even you had some players say that they've quit. I can't remember who the player was. Let me see if I can pull that up real quick. But even one of the players had to come out to say, yeah, it's looking pretty bad here, to the point where players have just signed off here. Maybe not for the season, but certainly what you saw there yesterday. And that's just a disgrace by the Jaguars here. No ifs, ands, buts, maybes about it. Let me take a better look as I pull this open here. Right, so there, 35-16, we know the final, etc. Now, the third storyline is Nick Sirianni, and I don't know why Sirianni, at the end of the game, is yelling toward the fans. He didn't say much in his post-game, just saying that it was intense out there and good to get a win, so on and so forth. It was against the Cleveland Browns, and you barely won the game on top of that. And for the Philly fan, we all know, one of the more fickle fan bases in this country. And whatever was said between he and the fan base, and who knows, I'm sure probably somebody popped open their camera on their phone, and maybe if you could do some lip reading, could kind of gather what Sirianni had said. And Sirianni, I think he's not on a hot seat, but he's up on the ropes right now, because this team has not played well this year. They've been average at best. And yes, just yesterday's performance is indicative of that. And for him to go after the fans, as we all know, whether it's an athlete, player, etc., when you try to attack the fans, you're doomed from the start. There is no redeeming quality to try to go after the fans. And now you're the head coach of the team. So now you're going to have to really put up here or shut up completely, because if not, the fans will have you out here on a rail. So I'm sure maybe he's been put on notice because of those antics there on the sidelines yesterday. But the Eagles, who are treading water in the NFC, and I get it that they're just a game behind the Commanders, and I want to say they play this week. I'll take a look at that and obviously unpack the schedule more so on Thursday's podcast. But Sirianni, you need to pipe down. Why are you even doing that? And I'm sure you know the psyche and how the Philadelphia fan, the Eagle fan in this case, how they are. So why would you even go? I don't care if you've been heckled from the start, booed, fire Sirianni. I don't care what they've said to you. Unless they're saying something about your family, and even then you have to zip it because it's a no-win situation. So Sirianni, now you're really going to have to reel off some wins here and try to get that fan base back in your favor, because the next time you go out there, especially in your building, and you underperform, the boo birds are going to be from the parking lot to Geno's Steaks and probably from the Liberty Bell, as it's going to reverberate throughout the city if your team slips up, falters, or certainly goes through another bad stretch, what we saw there last year in those last 5 games, and bottomed out in the postseason. But besides that, yes, you had a couple of games on the schedule that we could look at, but the NFL, is it me, or has this season been very underwhelming? And yes, you've had some good storylines, whether it's the Texans and what they've done here in their second year with D'Amico Ryans and C.J. Stroud. I talked about the Commanders, even though they lost yesterday, and that was a game where I said on Thursday's podcast that if they lose a close game, and I understand the score wasn't really close, it was 27-13, and yes, the Commanders tried to make a comeback, but in no way, shape, or form were the Ravens in peril of losing that game. And now that the Ravens, they are in midseason form. Those first couple of weeks you could throw out where they got off to a sluggish start, and now they seem to be on the express lane just bulldozing people. And Lamar, 20 for 26 with over 300 yards passing. Derrick Henry, who rushed again for well over 100 yards. And everything is clicking in Baltimore to the tune of now they're 4-2, tops with the Steelers there in the AFC North. And I can't knock what the Commanders did yesterday, as they didn't get blown out 38-6, where if that would have been the case, you would have been like, wait a second, Commanders could be some paper tigers here, but not the case. So they were able to at least play with the Ravens there for a half. They were down 17-10, but they pulled away, and even though they had to play catch-up, but Jaden Daniels did not have a bad game, even in his own right, because when you're down by a couple of scores, you got to take more chances. And even for Daniels, he didn't throw an interception. He kept protection of the ball and had good numbers, 24 for 35, 269 yards and 2 touchdowns. And then Lamar, we saw what he did, although he only threw for 1 touchdown and threw a pick. But certainly their offense has been clicking there in Baltimore. But a lot of the other games, and again, very underwhelming. And I could go through them all. Green Bay put it on the Arizona Cardinals, I believe, had a 24-0 lead and then won 34-13. We knew what happened on the other side of the pond, as I talked about, Bears 35-16. I don't want to hear from Seattle anymore. Thursday night, as I said there on the podcast then, if they're going to be a believer in my eyes, let me see them beat the Niners in their building, whether it was 3-2 or 50-49. What did you see there? A lambasting. It was 23-3 before you could even bat an eye, and yes, they did make it respectable, but they lost by 12, and certainly the Niners were in no threat of losing the game, so I don't want to hear from the Seahawks anymore. Sorry, and Brock Purdy had a big game, and the Niners now, although tied with the Seahawks for first place, but they had the edge with the tiebreaker beating Seattle, so I don't want to hear from the Seahawks. We're talking about Houston, New England, no shock there. Tampa beating New Orleans the way they did, and that was a first half that was big, to where the Saints had a 27-24 lead, and then after that, that's where the Buccaneers had a huge second half to where they just ran the table and scored 27 points of their own. in winning and unanswered, I might add. And the Saints scored 27 points in the second quarter just by themselves. But Baker Mayfield with a big game, although he threw 3 picks, but he did throw 4 touchdowns and over 300 yards. Spencer Rattler in his first start, listen, was admirable, 22 of 40, but certainly 2 interceptions, which hurt him. And Tampa, who got themselves back on the winning track after losing to Atlanta the week before, they win comfortably there in the Bayou. And speaking of which, Atlanta beats the Carolina Panthers, no shock there, as the Falcons are 4-2 to keep pace there with the Buccaneers. And the Falcons will have another home game, 5 of their first 7 at home, before closing out the year. Thinking about this, they're going to have, off the top of my head, 6 of their final 10 games on the road. So they did what they had to do against Carolina. Big game for the Falcons. Not really big offensively for Kirk Cousins, 19 for 30, 225 and a touchdown. But you had Ty Algier had a big game on the ground with 105 yards, and the Falcons did what they had to do against a lowly Panther team, as we all know. But again, nobody's going to write home about that game. Same for LA and Denver. The Chargers, even with the situation regarding one Jim Harbaugh, who had to leave there because he had, I believe it was an arrhythmia of his heart. But they had a 23-0 lead and coasted to a 23-16. I understand the score made it closer, but the Chargers were able to win rather comfortably there in the Mile High City. You also had the Tennessee and Indianapolis, 20-17, close game. But does anybody really care about the Colts? Joe Flacco again performing pretty well. Tennessee, we know they're going to have a long year, and that's a game a lot of people certainly wasn't in tune with. And then you have the Sunday night game, Bengals-Giants. I didn't watch one snap of this game. Obviously, I was wrapped up in the Met game. But they do win 17-7. Joe Burrow had a 47-yard touchdown run. Think about that. To open up the scoring. Then it was 7-7, but the Bengals prevailed. They scored 10 points in the second half, and they won 17-7 a game. A game that I'm sure a lot of people certainly fell asleep or were half in the bag at that point. And then you had the Steelers win. They were down 7-3 in the game. Justin Fields was not superb. Najee Harris got over 100 yards, but they got some turnovers. They were able to capitalize on some short fields and key situations, but the Steelers 32-13, a rather ho-hum game. And for them to keep pace with the Ravens in the division, remember, the Steelers are not going to face a divisional opponent until they get ready, week 11. And here we are right now in the middle of week 6. So keep that in mind, because now they have the Jets on a Sunday night, the Giants on a Monday night, and I believe they have a bye after that before they play the Commanders in Washington, and then they play the Ravens. And remember, people, 6 of the final 8 games of the Steelers schedule are all in the division, and the other 2 games are at Philadelphia, which they've never won in the franchise's history, and home to Kansas City on Christmas. And then I talked about Buffalo in the Jets there tonight just a little while ago. That's your NFL. Again, this has not been a big-time year so far. And I'm not trying to say that every week has to be of the highest drama, pins and needles, gnawing at your fingernails. We understand that this is now a gambling, fantasy football-driven sport where you're going to watch regardless. And that, to me, takes a lot of away of what the NFL is truly about. And when you look at it as a whole here over these first 6 weeks, yes, you do have a few storylines, as I mentioned. And if you want to even reach for a couple of others, when we take a 30,000-foot view of it, where to me it's the Texans, to me it's the Commanders and Jaden Daniels, what he's done. The Vikings at 5-0, got to give them props. Kansas City also undefeated, the last 2 undefeated teams who both had byes yesterday. You want to say maybe the Lions, but we expect the Lions, and they have a big game against the Vikings this week. That's going to be one of the top tier games to watch this coming week. But everything else is NFC West, after 6 weeks. NFC South, nobody expects a lot. I get it. You have Atlanta and Tampa, but are they going to be Super Bowl contenders? Not in the least. The AFC South, all right, we'll give you the Texans, fine. Besides that, AFC North, that could be a fight to the finish, but so far, that hasn't been of any note. I know the game last week, Baltimore and Cincinnati, but they haven't matched up against one another on a whole year, as I mentioned with Pittsburgh and Baltimore there in week 11 or week 12, whenever that game crops up. And now you have Bills-Jets tonight, which could be for first place, but those teams are around 500. So That's what you have. That's your NFL so far. And now let me pivot to the college game, because now here's going to be and let the aggregates begin, and I'm sure I'm not the only person saying this, but as I bring up what happened in college football, and you had a Saturday, just like the previous Saturday, where Alabama losing, the previous Saturday before that with Alabama beating Georgia, and you have some big games this week where Georgia goes to Texas and Alabama, Tennessee, and I'll talk about that more on Thursday's podcast. But the game of the year, and I understand the big comeback there by Georgia a couple of weeks ago, but that Ohio State-Oregon game was, no doubt, an old-school 15-round heavyweight fight. 7 lead changes, Dylan Gabriel versus Will Howard, the quarterback of Oregon, versus the quarterback of Ohio State. That was a college football game that pretty much topped Georgia-Alabama. And I get it that Georgia-Alabama, they're SEC rivals, and Oregon and Ohio State are now newly formed Big Ten rivals. So it's not going to have the same luster, although Oregon played in Ohio State a couple of years ago, if you remember. I believe that was the second week of the season where Oregon won in Ohio State. But even with all that, and 2 nights ago, that being the game of the year, here comes, people. The college football expansion playoff has ruined the college football regular season, because we may see these two teams not only play in the tournament, but they could match up against one another down the road. So it's almost as if we see them play again, I'm sure the anticipation will be heightened. I'm sure everybody's going to look forward to that. But what can they do for an encore? Remember, this game is probably going to be, in all likelihood, in a neutral setting. It's not going to be in Oregon, or let's say even at Ohio State, and even if that were to be the case, I'm sure they're not going to face off in a 5-12 scenario where they're going to be part of that bracket and not be in a situation where they're going to be the top 4 as a bye team. Because those top 4s, we know those games are going to be at neutral sites. I believe off the top of my head, I should double check that, but I think that's going to be the case. But, I mean, think about it. These regular season matchups that we've seen and that we've looked at and that we've dissected, and Georgia already with 1 loss, and now they got to go to Texas, who lambasted Oklahoma in the Red River Shootout. So no need to even unpack that game. But we've seen Georgia with 1 loss. We've seen Alabama with a loss. Now Ohio State with a loss. And even if Georgia and Alabama lose this week on the road to the aforementioned teams of the Longhorns and the Volunteers of Tennessee, they're still going to be in this mix. So we may see Georgia, Alabama again down the road. We may see them not only just in an SEC championship, but we could possibly also see them in the tournament. Same here for Ohio State and Oregon. And no matter how great that game was, and the Heisman Trophy, you would think they're going to be amongst the favorites to win the Heisman Trophy, especially after that performance. Even Will Howard in a loss and the numbers that he put up. But you figure now Dylan Gabriel with the inside track, especially with the way Alabama has not performed well here. And they barely got out alive against South Carolina there on Saturday. So it's a shame that we can't turn back the clocks to last year, because that was the final year where you had the 4 teams qualifying for a chance to win a national championship. This year, it's like, to me, it takes away a lot of the just jubilation that we've watched as fans. And it takes so much of the just juice out of these regular season games. Because, let's face it, if Georgia, and they still have to go to Ole Miss later on in the year, if Georgia has 3 losses, could they still make it to the tournament? I'm going to say yes, because they're Georgia. Now, if there's going to be another team that the committee looks at and sees that, oh no, we're going to have to put this team in over Georgia. And unlike last year, I get he had an undefeated Florida team, and with Alabama beating the Bulldogs there in the SEC championship game, and then of course you had a scenario where they had to put in Alabama there as a 4 seed, and you knew it was going to be Michigan there, and they had no choice. They had to take Georgia out, and you could argue that and split hairs. But this year, even if they do lose 3 games, are you going to look at Iowa State as a team that you're going to slide in there? Of course, Iowa State, as well as they played, but they don't have the appeal. It's not as if they have the allure of the Georgia Bulldogs and what they've done here over the last half decade. A lot of these teams that could have 2 and 3 losses. 2, I think you're in, no problem. But let's say they do get to 3, and I'm just going to use Georgia as the example because of the tough road test that they have ahead. And then Alabama, they can lose to Tennessee this week. No shock there. So this is where the regular season, to me, just gets swallowed up because of the college football playoff. They have the safety net. They have that landing. And until we get to late November, December, where the committee's going to look at this, then we could say, okay. But it's going to be after the fact. It's not going to be a thing that as the season wears on that, this team is definitely not going to make it. Or, this team, they're out. Or, there's no way that the committee's going to pick this team. Obviously, that's still time to process and unfold. But based on what I've seen here over the first 7 weeks of the college football season, as great as these games have been, and to see these teams have one loss, if this was a year ago, this would have been fascinating to see how this was going to unfold. As of right now, it's still going to be fascinating, but it's been knocked down 2 to 3 pegs in my eyes. Because I think that these teams that already have one loss on the ledger and maybe staring at 2 losses, and dare I even say 3, I think they're going to find a way to get in. Because of their strength of schedule, because of their competition, and I'm sure as we go through the rankings, there's going to be teams out there that we're going to look at and say, yes, they may be deserving, and yes, they may be a team that's going to maybe upset the apple cart when it's all said and done based on what the committee selects. But like I mentioned, Iowa State, I understand they're ranked 9th right now, but let's say they lose a game or 2. Or let's say they have 1 loss and Georgia has 2 losses. They're probably going to take Iowa State because of the expansion, but if they somehow fall out of the top 12 or they're hanging around there, you mean to tell me they're not going to take Georgia over Iowa State? I'd like to see that committee do that because you know there's going to be a faction in Athens that are just going to be up in arms. That, all right, Iowa State's won 1 game, but come on, they're Iowa State. Who have they played this year as opposed to us? And we could split hairs. We could talk about, look at the conferences that these teams play in and so on and so forth. And I get it. But that's going to be a factor here. So for Iowa State, I don't know if they're going to be able to survive a 2-loss Georgia team in order for them to leapfrog them to get into the tournament. Or even, let's say, a BYU team. Or A&M. And I understand they play in the Big 12. Oh, excuse me, Texas A&M. I know they move in these conferences all the time. They play in the SEC. I don't know whether or not you're going to see these teams last and make it into a college football playoff that doesn't have the reputation, that doesn't have the pedigree, that doesn't have a lot of the juice that we've seen here, especially when it's the SEC, Big Ten in particular, and a smattering of Big 12 teams. I mean, seriously, Boise State, the Indianas of the world, if they creep up, and Indiana, they could be undefeated when the season's over. But if you have a 1-loss Alabama team, a 2-loss Georgia team, LSU who beat Ole Miss, and Ole Miss has already been knocked out of the top 12. They were ranked 9th going into that game. And kudos to Garrett Nussmeier with the touchdown pass to Kyron Lacey in overtime. Big game. As LSU now moves up into the top 10, this is what I mean about these teams jockeying for position. And even though it's been expanded, but these teams you would think are going to make it. And I'm talking about the big teams as opposed to the little engines that could, or the teams that have played so well, whether they go undefeated or have the 1 loss but are deserving to get in. Is it all going to matter when it's all said and done? That's what I'm talking about with the college football. And give it up for Penn State. Big win there at USC. I talked about that briefly there on Thursday's podcast, whether or not Lincoln Riley would show up, and they certainly did. And they were down 14 points in the second half. And Penn State behind their quarterback, Drew Allar, and even Kerry Collins, the former Penn State quarterback of yesteryear, said that he loves Allar and he loves the Nittany Lions' chances, but they still have to beat the Ohio States of the world and even to a certain extent the Michigans of the world. If they don't beat Michigan this year, then they're never going to beat them. But Penn State now ranked 3rd in the nation, and even with Oregon now going up to number 2, where Ohio State goes down to number 4, with Texas still being ranked number 1. Those are your top 4 teams, with Georgia 5th in the nation, followed by Miami, Alabama, LSU, Iowa State, and Clemson. They round out the top 10. And then you have Tennessee, Notre Dame, the top 12. And I only say the top 12 because of the 12 teams that will qualify, but this doesn't automatically mean that whomever's in the top 12 will automatically get a bid. You have BYU, Texas A&M, Boise State round out 13 through 15. And then after that, Indiana, K-State, Kansas State, Ole Miss goes from 9 all the way to 18. And they already have 2 losses on their ledger. So now, think about this. If Ole Miss runs the table, including a win against Georgia, and let's say Georgia beats Texas, and that's going to be a slugfest, we would think. But let's say they beat Texas, and now Ole Miss and Georgia have 2 losses. But you have a team like Iowa State, let's say they run the table. They may get in because they will probably continue to move up, and the committee will select them. But let's just say BYU, right now 13th, and will probably be hovering around, depending on the other teams, if they do fall back to the pack. You mean to tell me that a 2-loss, and let's just say for argument's sake, if Georgia beats Texas, but then Ole Miss beats Georgia, and both teams have 2 losses, what's going to happen there? It's going to be riveting, and it's going to be compelling, to say the least, how this is all going to shape up. But to me, the regular season just swallows it up. And I would think that these teams, even with the 2 losses, they're going to find a way to get in. Now, I hope they prove me wrong. I hope they say, wow, they really took a lot in consideration to say, hey, listen, although they have 2 losses, but we had to put in BYU because although not a strong conference, but they are worthy of being in the top 12, or at least 5 through 12 here to qualify for the playoff. I'm bringing that up now, people, because keep this as a receipt as we move forward, and that's what you have there with college football. All right, I'm going to wrap up with the NHL as I lace up the skates. NBA, am I going to get into this Dante DiVincenzo, Rick Brunson deal? No, please. The Timberwolves were at the Garden last night in a exhibition to where there were some words at the end of the game between DiVincenzo, the former Knicks player, who got traded just a few weeks ago, with Julius Randle for, and I guess I'm talking NBA now, but for Karl Anthony Towns, Minnesota, as they played against each other for the first time. And there was sharing some words there. And even during the free throw line, DiVincenzo directed some words at Rick Brunson, who's an assistant coach of the Knicks. But, right, am I going to get wrapped up in that? Let me just abort right now. NHL, some interesting storylines here as we conclude this first week. I talked about the Utah Hockey Club a little bit last week. They won their first game, beating the Blackhawks there before coming east here to make a 3-stop tour in the tri-state area as they play the Islanders on Thursday, the Rangers Saturday, and they conclude with a trip to Newark to play the Devils tonight. And here's what the Utah Hockey Club has done so far. They are 3-0, one of a handful of teams that have started off the year 3-0, including the Dallas Stars, Winnipeg Jets, Vegas Golden Knights, and even the Calgary Flames, who I picked as an under at 81 this year, 81.5. So they're making me look like a fool. And the Devils are 3-1. Although not undefeated, but they have 3 wins in their back pocket already. But they beat the Islanders in overtime. In fact, the 2 wins on this trip beat the Islanders in overtime 5-4. They beat the Rangers in a wild game there on Saturday night. Bunch of lead changes and goals scored everywhere, especially 7 in that second period. And then they won it in overtime there on Saturday night. So let's see if they could complete the hat trick and sweep the New York, New Jersey teams here in their only appearance in this area throughout the years. They get it out of the way here before the end of Columbus Day, or Indigenous Peoples Day as it is as well in this country. So for the Utah Hockey Club, Dylan Guenther with 5 goals already leading the NHL. And think about this, people. The Arizona Coyotes, once they left and were bought by Ryan Miller, who owns the Utah Jazz, this is a new franchise. This isn't a continuation of the Coyotes, who are now part of the Utah Hockey Club. So this isn't the Seattle Sonics by way going to the Oklahoma City Thunder and being a part of the Seattle/OKC Thunder, or even a situation where the Minneapolis Lakers, I got to throw that to tweet the Laker fan, the Minneapolis Lakers, who won, 5 titles in Minneapolis, go to LA and then win 12 more, so they have 17. As we all know, they've taken those 5 championships as the Laker franchise and called it their own. Utah is now pretty much an expansion team, despite the fact them not being an expansion team a la the Vegas Golden Knights or a team like that, or the Seattle Kraken for that matter. So, great start by Utah. Let's see if they can get the sweep there tonight in New Jersey. And on the flip side of that, and we saw this last year when I thought they started 2-10, but I believe they started 3-9. Some Stanley Cup hangover for the Edmonton Oilers. They are 0-3 to start the year. All 3 games they lost at home, and they got outscored 15-3 in the process. Connor McDavid, Leon Draisaitl, are they still in the summer slumber of a Game 7 defeat down in Sunrise, South Florida, to where they lost the Stanley Cup Final to the Panthers? You cannot get off to a brutal start than that. And for Edmonton to lose those games, and they actually have the Flyers coming into their building, I believe, if not tonight, tomorrow. So they're actually starting the first 4 games of the season in their building. And they still haven't shown up. They got blown up by Calgary 6-0. I believe it was 6. No, it was the Jets. Winnipeg 6-0 in the first game. And I believe they lost 3-1 just the other night against the Calgary Flames. So let's see if they could get on track. And maybe they're looking at it from, hey, we got them where we want them, considering we started off slow last year. But remember, they fired their head coach last year after that slow start, to where Chris Knobloch, the current coach, was able to come in. They had 2 big winning streaks, including a 16-game winning streak last year, if you recall. And then obviously made it all the way to a 7th game of a Stanley Cup Final. So let's see how that plays out. Then you have a couple of injuries. Macklin Celebrini, the number 1 overall pick by the San Jose Sharks, who had a goal and assist in his first game as a pro, will be on IR maybe for a couple of weeks, at least for the next 2 games, with a lower body injury. So tough break for San Jose as they're trying to get themselves back on track as a franchise, and especially with their current number 1 overall. So let's see when he gets back into the fold. And then you have the Stanley Cup champion Panthers lose their captain for what may be 2 to 3 weeks with a lower body injury there, and a one Alexander Barkov. So let's see what's going to happen with Barkov's progression as they lose a key piece there to their team. And who knows if they're going to miss him or if they won't skip a beat, considering the Panthers trying to defend their Stanley Cup championship. And right now, let me see how they're doing in the standings, because I just looked at the teams that obviously have been undefeated or doing well, and the team that hasn't won, and I believe they're one of a handful of teams, but knowing that they've already lost 3 games in the Edmonton Oilers, considering they made it to a Cup final. But the Panthers have lost their last 2 games, considering that the home opener, they beat the Bruins in raising the cup to the rafters there. So let's see if they could supplement the loss of Barkov there. Obviously, the captain, heart and soul of their team, if they're able to fill in those skates rather admirably in his absence. So that we'll have to wait and see. And that'll do it, my good people. Another episode just about the books. As always, thank you so much for stopping by, carving out precious time out of your day to listen to what it is I have to say about what goes on in this wonderful toy department of life called sports. If you haven't done so, people, please subscribe, rate, review, throw me a few stars, write a review on Apple, Spotify, the website, JAYREELZ.com, my YouTube channel. Please subscribe there, as I'm trying to increase the visibility on all platforms, and on YouTube at JAYREELZ, where I post daily shorts to bring you the latest of what's happening as far as any news stories, anything that crops up throughout the course of a day, afternoon, evening, as I'll share my thoughts in 1 minute. So that's it. It's a quick minute short detailing my thoughts, feelings, and opinions on a specific topic. And if you want to hit me up with a question, comment, or suggestion, you can do so at the following: on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, the JAYREELZ Podcast, Twitter, X, JAYREELZ1, just the number, the old-fashioned way, the JAYREELZ Podcast at gmail.com. You know that I'll be more than happy to follow up with you guys and gals, because whether you do or do not know, this is what I love to do, people. It's in the blood, it's in the DNA, talking sports since birth, sharing nothing but fire, passion, energy, fury, with my thoughts, opinions, critiques, praise, analysis, feelings on anything and everything that happens on the world of the diamond, ice, gridiron, hardwood, golf course, racetrack, tennis court, boxing ring, octagon, you name it. From my lips to your ears, from my heart to your soul, from where I am to wherever you are, the JAYREELZ Podcast always comes correct, direct, and in full effect. From the South Bronx to South Beach to South Central to South Pacific and all points beyond, peace, love, and God bless everybody. And until next time on the JAYREELZ Podcast, on the flip, baby.